Okay, welcome to session number 10 of Genesis in Depth. I'm Dr. John McMath. I'm joined here by my friends in the Philippines, in Italy, and in a variety of places here in the U.S. Sometimes on YouTube and Facebook, we find people from all over the place. I get notes from people asking questions or disagreeing with me or whatever. And I love all of those. I treasure those. So it's a fun thing to do. We're going to be today continuing in the book of Genesis. We hammered on Genesis 6 back in June when we were finishing up about um, the concept of grace as the exception to the wrath of God. The grace of God is the provision of all of the resources necessary for salvation and for the Christian life. So, grace is a huge concept. It's a very important concept in Christian theology. Grace is everything that God does for us that we could not possibly do for ourselves. I was preaching on the rich young ruler last Sunday, and the closing lines that Jesus uses in that episode is this young man is going away, and Jesus says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to go to heaven. And the apostles are asking, well, who can be saved then? Jesus says, with a man, this is impossible, but with God, everything is possible. The point is that salvation is entirely the work of God. This is a grace thing. God is gracious. All of us deserve the wrath of God. And that's the point of Genesis 6. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Okay? But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And the word favor there, grace. Grace in all of its nuances is the exception to the wrath of God. Grace is nothing we deserve, it never could be. Grace is nothing we can earn and never could be. Grace is simply a gift from God, in spite of the fact that we have deserved his wrath. And so that's what the flood is actually all about. When we look at this flood narrative, it's easy to get tied up in the all of the details and arguing about how many different kinds there were and how big the ark was and all of the details. When in fact the fundamental issue is central to biblical theology. And this is the grace of God, the way of salvation, and the work involved in salvation is that which is provided by God Himself. God is the one who does this thing, and that grace is the rescue from the wrath which sin deserves. And that theme is uh, not exactly introduced here, but is developed in its full form here, but is reiterated, reemphasized, approached from different angles all the way through the Old Testament, and then brought to its culmination in the Gospels and in particularly in the epistles of Paul, as Paul describes what salvation really is. In uh, in John, God sent His Son that whoever believes should not perish. That's the relationship. We're all going to perish unless God does something, does some impossible thing by graciously sending salvation. That's the point. Paul says, "For it is by grace you're saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God." So the grace is central there. Noah didn't earn his place on the ark by collecting animals and being good. Noah was given a place on the ark along with his family. So anyway, we're going to get there. But what I want to work through today is some of the scientific details. People think, oh, well, it rained for a few days and stuff got wet. That's what the flood was. Maybe a river went over its banks in Romania or somewhere, and that's what the story is about. It really isn't. It's about a worldwide catastrophe, a truly extensive catastrophe, and the description itself is of the entire world covered with water, and that water for half a year sloshing around as the Earth was turning on its axis. Uh, the moon in its orbit around the Earth would have been pulling on that water on the surface of the ground to create tides. The tides with the circling Earth, because of the Coriolis effect, would have been swirling. And with no continents to slow these tidal waves down, to stop these currents from getting bigger and bigger, it would have been it would have been a spectacular thing. What that did was an enormous amount of erosion. The underlying rocks, which are basalt and granite primarily, various kinds of granite, various kinds of basalt, uh, were ground away, leaving leaving a surface that is relatively level. And then as the water sloshed around, in some places over wide areas, sediment dropped out of that water and formed layers. And we find this is true all over the surface of the earth. Most parts of the world, the rocks that we find at the surface are sedimentary: limestone, sandstone, various kinds of conglomerates, uh, that kind of stuff. The lower rocks are igneous, things like granite and basalt that came out of a volcano. Uh, and the sedimentary rock is all at the surface. As we go down all the way to the Precambrian era, we find fossils in those sedimentary rocks. And again, this is true all over the world. Uh, One of the fascinating things about geology is studying the fossils, and it's interesting to listen to the secular geologists and secular scientists talking about this, because they date the stones by looking at the fossils. They date the fossils by looking at the stones. They've got a circular argument going on. Well, how old are the stones? Well, these date to the Cambrian era. Oh, how can you tell? Well, because of these fossils. Oh, well, how old are the fossils? Well, they're probably Cambrian era fossils. Why is that? Because the stones are Cambrian era. Excuse me. That isn't necessarily true. So there are two issues that that have to be detailed. Well, there's a lot of issues as we get into this, and one has to do with the timing. How long ago did the creation and then the flood happen? And secondly, how long did all of this take? And for my money, one of the best places on the planet to study the geologic history of the Earth is the Grand Canyon in the Southwest United States. Uh, the Colorado River runs through a plateau there that reaches up to, well, the initial plateau was at 12,000 feet. Uh, how did that happen? The scientists have to say that there used to be a river that ran uphill, came down the other side, and eroded this spectacular canyon. And again, that doesn't work very well. They want it to be millions of years old. Let's talk about some of that. I'm going to see if I can make the share screen work here. Oh yeah, there it is. Got too many things showing. Let's see if we can make it work. There we go. Okay. I call this young Earth creationism. It's the idea that God created the heavens and the earth relatively recently, and that the flood explains most of the geologic features on the face of the earth. Uh, Modern secular uh, scientists reject this out of hand, and they've got reasons for that. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit. Uh, a lot of Christians grow up in a secular society, obviously. And if we go to school in the a public school arena or with secular teachers, we're going to be taught that the earth is many, many millions of years old, and man evolved from lower animals, and the um, processes that take place on the earth are um, consistent. They never change, and no catastrophe has ever happened. The secular model, since it has no God, requires many, many, many millions of years in order to give it even a statistical uh, possibility, and it isn't even then. There's too much complexity for the universe to have evolved from nothing. Nevertheless, secularists don't have a choice. Let's look at what we've got here. We'll talk about the problems and how these are solved. Uh, the problem for Christians is that the Bible is clear about the events of the creation, the fall, and the flood. These things are not obscure right-wing conspiracies that show up in a little verse here and a little verse there. The Old Testament is full of creation imagery, of flood imagery, of the problem of sin and the result of sin in the lives of people. The Bible is actually really clear about all of these things. It lays these things out in significant detail. The real change in Western philosophy happened after the Reformation, during the 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century, and a period of time in Europe that we call the Enlightenment. Secular thinkers began looking for ways to eliminate God from scientific thinking. Um, the thinkers like oh God, trying to think of who to use as a uh, uh, Immanuel Kant, um, Marcuse is more recent. Um, uh, Descartes was actually a Christian, but a lot of the philosophers of that time demanded a naturalistic explanation for everything. And scientists of that era and into the modern era have insisted that science cannot um, look at issues that involve God. There's some Christians like to call themselves scientists. You know, they say that in spite of being Christian, I have to approach scientific questions as though there were no God. Well, I don't think that's realistic. God either is or he isn't. And it is frankly irrational to believe that the universe exists without a cause. Uh, that cause has to be God. Uh, when we work through all of uh, the bits of that, special creation by supernatural means, a worldwide judgment by supernatural means, and a relatively young Earth are all demanded by a careful study of the biblical text. That's what the Bible actually teaches. The secular world would really rather not have that. So a couple of terms are necessary for us to understand, or to understand the secular background here. The first is evolution. Now, there's two ways of looking at evolution. The term itself simply means change or change over time. So when some process is underway, we can call that an evolution. The term is used uh, in the Navy. So if you're going to submerge a submarine, you go through an evolution. There are several things in the process that have to happen, and everybody in the crew has something to do, and they're going up, they're going down, and the submarine goes beneath the waves, and everything is checked, and it's all happen, and then the evolution is finished. Okay, I understand that. That's a good way to use the word. Uh, Bacteria and viruses have a tendency to evolve. The recent COVID virus started out as kind of dangerous and was not terribly good at passing around. And as it learned how to move from one to another, it got less dangerous. It evolved over time. And if you caught the COVID virus early in its existence, you might have gotten pretty sick, and you were probably immune from that particular virus for a good long time. But now people who caught that first one are beginning to be uh, subject to some of the later versions of the COVID virus, which are much less deadly and pass around very easily. And so it'll go through town. Everybody will feel a little miserable for a few days, and then it's done. Viruses evolve, bacteria evolves. We know that. Bacteria, plural, have learned to be resistant to antibiotics. Fascinating. The organism that causes malaria has been studied an awful lot. There are many parts of the world this is still a really, really bad thing, and malaria is quite dangerous. And that organism has evolved to be resistant to various kinds of treatment. That's one of the things that continues to make it dangerous. The very best thing for malaria is to kill mosquitoes. But since uh, the banning of DDT many years ago, 50 some years ago, on false premises, uh, it's no longer allowable to do that, and so people die. Many people in Africa die from malaria every year. Sickle cell anemia in African people actually is an evolutionary process to resist malaria that actually makes people sick. So all of those things we call microevolution. Okay, so changes happen within a species. The bacteria doesn't turn into a mouse, for example. The mouse doesn't turn into an elephant. The elephant doesn't turn into a butterfly. Uh, those things don't happen because evolution doesn't happen on that scale. There is a kind of micro evolution, but there is no macro or large scale evolution. The idea that species arise by natural selection over very great lengths of time from some primitive original life form became popular in the 19th century after the work of Charles Darwin. It was an idea that had been around for a while, but nobody had suggested anything resembling a mechanism. And Darwin says, well, perhaps it's just a natural selection, the survival of the fittest. And if there are two butterflies and one of them has wings and the other doesn't, the one with wings will probably survive better, so it will be fine. And so over the millions of years, while the butterfly is trying to decide whether it's going to have wings or not, what did all those butterflies do? Well, no answer to that, but natural selection is the one. What Darwin didn't understand and what modern scientists certainly know but ignore is that there are not merely thousands, but many millions of individual genetic traits that make up any individual organism. And that this is not a simple thing, is actually very complex. Uh, and the chances of two or three random mutations happening in the right order and in a constructive direction are virtually uh, non-existent. The chances are so low. The probability uh, approaches the vanishing point. And then when you're looking at many, many thousands of individual genetic characteristics that have to work in exactly the right way or the organism dies, there is no realistic explanation of how that can happen. Anyway, that's evolution, and it's a very popular idea, in spite of the fact that it's virtually nonsense. Uh, the term uniformitarianism is the idea that the processes that are now in action uh, in the earth and in the universe explain all past events and the present shape of the earth and the kinds of things that we see on the earth. Now, this has led secularists in general to adopt an old earth view, many millions or perhaps billions of years. It's uh, common these days to speak of an age of the universe of some 20 billion years. Uh, and that's extremely common. That you hear it all the time, even in places where you wouldn't necessarily think about it. The difficulty within the church is that many modern Christian thinkers, including teachers and pastors and people who are important to the church, have capitulated to the secular viewpoints. And the problem is that these positions can't both be true. There really is no such thing as theistic evolution. There really isn't. You can't have it both ways. This is just a few of the things that are part of it. In the secular view, the Earth is very old, many millions or billions of years. In the biblical viewpoint, the Earth is relatively young. In the secular viewpoint, evolution is the mechanism. The Bible speaks of creation. The atheist would insist on a materialistic explanation. The Bible speaks of a supernatural or outside of the material universe explanation. The secular viewpoint is atheistic. There is no God. Christians who want to accept the evolutionary uniformitarian explanations need to understand that the basic presupposition of those is atheistic. There is no God, and God is in fact irrelevant. The uh, uh, biblical viewpoint is theism. God is at the center. God is at the beginning. He will end it all. In the beginning, God. Now, they can't both be true. If God is, in fact, who he claims to be and who he demonstrates himself to be in the Bible, then the whole evolutionary hypothesis is utterly unnecessary. It's a complication of what is actually a fairly simple story. Uh, so, if the secular view is correct, then the Bible is clearly wrong, not only about creation and the flood, but about just about everything else, about the nature of God, about the need for salvation, about the course of human history, and much else. If we can't trust Genesis, why do we suppose we can trust the Gospel of John? What is it about John that makes it inherently trustable if Genesis is not trustable? And I might say also Isaiah. Uh, Christians really ought to take a serious look at earth and biological sciences through a theocentric lens. Uh, ought to spend at least a little time thinking about these things. So I'm going to introduce you to the Grand Canyon. If you're one of those, I'm looking around here to see who was there. There may be some folks in today's audience who were with me in Cosenza on that Tuesday night before I headed north. And I showed some slides from the Grand Canyon. That was a set I call 200 slides from a moving raft. Some years ago, I think about 10 years ago, I joined the Answers in Genesis group that took two rafts down the Grand Canyon, along with some geologists and some theologians. And everybody that was invited on this trip was a Bible or theology professor from somewhere, including one fellow from Australia and another from the United Kingdom. So quite a diverse group, all men, and we camped out on the shore and we floated down the river for a week. Grand Canyon is one of the finest places on the planet to study the evidence for the origins and the development of both geology and biology. The reason for that is that this canyon is huge. It's roughly 500 miles long. It's up to a mile deep in the canyon area itself, 2 miles deep if you look at the whole Colorado Plateau. The river that runs through the canyon could not have cut it. A much larger formation that we call the Grand Staircase covers most of the western United States, the Rocky Mountains area, and continues the uplifted strata 5,000 feet above the rim of the Grand Canyon itself in a very broad area. When we're in the Grand Canyon, what we're seeing is a long series of sedimentary rock, limestone, shale, sandstone, other kinds of specific sedimentary rocks. And you can see the layers, the different colors, and they're quite visible. Grand Canyon is unusual in that it's in the desert, so there's not much growing here. not much in the way of trees and grass and whatnot that make it difficult to see the rocks. The rocks are clearly visible, and the layers are clearly visible. These sedimentary rocks are full of fossils laid on top of, we've got like 28 layers in the Grand Canyon, laid on top of an underlying system of granite and basalt that we call the basement rocks. There are also volcanic sills and older non-fossil bearing sedimentary rock. So we've got basement rock, we've got some sedimentary rock without fossils, then we've got sedimentary rock going all the way to the surface, the Kaibab Plateau, 5,000 feet above, with lots and lots and lots and lots of fossils. So a trip into the Grand Canyon is a trip through geologic history. And as we start, we begin looking at the upper layers and we slowly move through. Actually, the river is gradually going downhill. The plateau was lifted up. It wasn't flat, and the river cut down. The plateau was lifted up, and the water running off cut this canyon. So as we get into the canyon, I'm going to give you just a brief look at it here. I've got another sequence that we may have time for today, but we may not. This is Coconino sandstone. And if you looking at this slide, the coconino is the lighter color. The stuff on the very top is a limestone called the Kaibab limestone or Kaibab formation. The coconino is the third layer down. It's a sandstone, and it's full of fossils, mostly marine type fossils, marine worms and other kinds of stuff. It's interesting. We also see footprints of some kind of small animals that were running around in this area at the time. Uh, there are three things that make the Coconino sandstone interesting. Uh, First of all, it's found in most of the North American continent. It literally covers the whole continent. I found outcroppings of the Coconino sandstone in Kansas. There was my son and I were driving across the country and stayed in a motel and walking across the motel parking lot to get something to eat at a little cafe in the gas station the other side of this big parking lot. We walked past a wall. It was made up of blocks of the local sandstone rock, and it was Coconino sandstone, full of fossils, marine fossils. That one happened to be shells of some kind of marine shellfish. We don't know what. So it's all over the North American continent. We found it. We find it all over North Africa. Not in any one place. We find it in a lot of different outcroppings all over North Africa. And it continues on into the Middle East. We see it famously in the Sinai Peninsula and on into Central Asia, for instance, in the Himalayas, which gigantic mountains up to 27,000 some odd feet for Mount Everest. All of that is sedimentary rock. It's tipped on edge and pointed way up in the air, but sedimentary rock, and we find Coconino sandstone in the Himalayas. A fascinating thing. The second point is that it's full of marine fossils, just all the time. It's clearly not, it was never a desert. Even the Coconino sandstone that we find in the Sahara Desert was never a desert. It wasn't formed in a desert. It was formed underwater. Then thirdly, it's cross-bedded. And if you look at this central part, so below the term worldwide, you see a line. Above that is limestone. Below that is this coconino sandstone. And then there's some rubble that's fallen off of it. But that other stuff is coconino. Under the terms marine fossils, you'll see the beds are kind of to the left. Off on the right side, you see there's several different directions of cross bedding. What's interesting about the cross bedding is that these are very common in sand dunes. So the secular scientists have called these coconino sand dune or coconino cross bedding examples of a sand dune. The problem with that, of course, is the marine fossils. And the other problem is the angle of the cross bedding. You can see it's not consistent. But in a desert, the cross bedding happens at a consistent angle of 30 to 32 degrees. We can demonstrate that by going to places like the Sahara Desert or the Mojave Desert and looking at how sand dunes actually work. The wind blows sand, it comes over a crest and then falls down, and that the front side, the drop side of the sand dune, uh, produces cross bedding. And the angle is usually 30 to 32 degrees. Coconino sandstone all over the world, uh, every place we find it, can consistently cross beds at a shallower angle, what you see here, between 17 and 25 degrees. The cross bedding actually happens, well, we see it today, when a hurricane gets close to land and develops a storm surge underwater offshore, and that water comes ashore as either a tidal wave or as very high tides. The storm surge moves a lot of sand underwater, and the deposits of that sand are cross-bedded at between 17 and 25 degrees consistently. And layers like that can be formed in surprising depth in a matter of hours. So this explains the coconino crossbedding, and it explains the presence of marine fossils. This was formed underwater. All of the layers of the Grand Canyon contain marine fossils and were formed underwater. Limestone is always formed in water. Sandstone doesn't have to be formed underwater. When it is, you'll find the crossbedding. So we're talking about uh, the the argument for a flood. Now, the Grand Canyon sequence goes through a whole bunch of different things till we get all the way down to the bottom of the sedimentary sequence. The lowest of the fossil-bearing rocks is called Tapeats sandstone. It's interesting stuff. We began seeing the Tapeats sandstone about 3 days into the Grand Canyon. It's layered, and you can see various layers made up of fairly large grain material, big chunks of rough crystals. It's cross-bedded, usually at 17 to 22 degrees, and it contains loads of marine fossils. It's a different consistency of the sand that makes it clear that this is a different material than the coconino. Interestingly, the Tapeats sandstone lies over a sequence of igneous and other sedimentary rocks that are tilted at about a 45-degree angle. that we call the Grand Canyon sequence. And this sequence is significant for two reasons. First of all, no fossils. And secondly, the top of the formation is cut off sharply, very cleanly, and is overlaid by the Tapeats Formation. So something really big and fast moving ground the sedimentary rock down to a level surface, and then the sandstone was put down on top of that. Okay, interesting stuff. Uh, Another place where we find the Tapeats sandstone, also famously, is in the Sinai Peninsula. This is a guide in the Sinai. I asked him if he knew of any of the Sinai inscriptions when I was in Egypt years ago. Nice kid, name is Nasir. And he said, sure, he knows where they are, and he guided the bus to the spot, and we parked the bus and walked for a while out into the desert, and he showed me the some inscriptions in the rock, which were great to see because I'd studied them in school. And it happens to be that this rock out in the middle of the Sinai, covering a vast area, is the Tapeats sandstone. Very coarse grained, cross-bedded, full of marine fossils. Um, how do you explain the same layer, the same material in two completely separate places on the planet? And in fact, we find Tapeats sandstone in many parts of North America, many parts of South America. The Andes range contains Tapeats sandstone. We find it in parts of Central and Northern Africa, into the Sinai and into India. So it's not a local phenomenon. It's actually a very, very big deal. Okay, that sandstone lies on top of other sedimentary rock. Geologists call this the Great Unconformity, and they have a lot of difficulty with the formation. The rock, the darker rock below that line is Precambrian. The rock above that, although it's bleached out here, the color is different, is the Tapeats sandstone. They call the Tapeats layer Cambrian, and the rock underneath is Precambrian. Precambrian means before there was life. And they speak of the Cambrian explosion in the Tapeats sandstone and all the way to the top of the Grand Canyon layers. We find fossils. In the Tapeats itself, 39 of the 40 phylums of animal life are found in the sedimentary sequence. And as we go up, all 40 of the animal phyla are found in the Grand Canyon. Now, what is that saying? It's saying that there's a mixture of living things that are buried here. This uh, uh, grand unconformity or great unconformity is not the beginning of life. It is the first great episode of death. Generally speaking, fossils aren't formed today. If an animal dies out in the woods, heaven forbid, and you feel sorry for an animal that dies in the woods, but if an animal dies out in the woods, the carcass lies there. Various birds and scavenger animals eat the flesh off, and they eventually crunch down the bones. And insects come and take it apart in small bits. The bones and other other parts, harder parts, slowly rot until there's nothing left. Within a couple of years, there's nothing left there. Fossils are formed when an organism is buried under a great deal of material very quickly. A fossil can only form during a really, really major flood. And if it's buried close enough to the surface that microorganisms can function, then that that thing will not turn into a fossil. It will just be eaten up. And that's the way God created things. There's a self-cleaning mechanism in the environment. What we're looking at here at the great unconformity is not the beginning of life. We're looking at the beginning of a great death. The secularists look at that great unconformity and they say there's 1.5 billion years of evolutionary time missing. They don't see where the evolution should be happening. They expect to see fossils all over the place, but there aren't any. And then all of a sudden we see every kind of fossil there is. Why is that? And perhaps it's because the Grand Canyon is not a record of the sequence of life appearing on the earth. It's a record of the death of the vast majority of animals and life forms that were on the earth at the time of the flood. So the Grand Canyon is a record of a gigantic marine catastrophe. Yeah, lots and lots and lots of things are buried here, and they form fossils. Okay, about the beginning of the fourth day into the Grand Canyon, we begin seeing basement rocks. We're getting far enough down. We're a full mile, 1.5 kilometers into the crust of the earth, which has been folded up. It's been lifted up, and now the river runs down through the base of it. The canyon is not getting deeper. The current Colorado River does not carve the rock any further. Uh, and so we're all the way down as far as we're going to get. These basement rocks are a combination of uh, what is called the Vishnu and the Shiva formations. And the black rock is a kind of metamorphic rock called schist, a kind of basalt. It's a volcanic rock that has come out of a volcano. The pinker rock that you see on the left, the blacker rock is on the right, and there's some pink rock on the left, is a kind of granite. And granite and basalt, or schist and gneiss and some others, are very hard and they're dense, and they form the foundation of the earth all over the planet. Everywhere we go, we dig through the surface layer of stone, which is sedimentary rock laid down by water. Everywhere we go, except for a few places where it's blown by wind at the surface. We go down far enough and we find that the sedimentary rock with the fossils in it is going to be waterborne. The igneous rock, igneous is a Latin word that means fire, and the rock was formed under molten conditions. So it was melted rock out of a volcano or living deep underground. And the difference between rocks has a lot to do with how quickly they solidified, which doesn't matter a whole lot for us right now. But they formed underground. There was a lot of pressure. They hardened fairly slowly and form fairly large crystals. Granite has bigger crystals and basalt has smaller crystals. There's a way to tell. Obviously, at some time or another, there's a lot of movement that took place with these rocks. A whole bunch of movement as on the third day of creation week, the basement rocks and the what little sediment had occurred over the top were lifted up so the dry land appeared. When that happened, the magma from underneath pushed up to lift up an entire continental area. This all happened over the period of a day, very violent activity. Lots of sedimentation would have taken place at that time and over the following 1500 or so years until the flood. The basement rocks show the effects of this fracturing and a molten rock coming up through the cracks. It's fascinating to go through and to look at this. Okay. As we come toward the end of the Grand Canyon, we passed an area where the Tapeats sandstone is folded. This covers a very wide area. I wish I had somebody standing here because a human figure in the middle of this would give some size to it. The width of this picture is about 100 yards, 100 meters. The depth is about 75 meters. So this is a very large area. The layers here don't appear to have fractured particularly. The secularists say that these things had to have formed over millions of years under immense pressure and were bent under a lot of heat and a lot of pressure. Those of us who hold to a Genesis flood argue that this appears to be a layer that was bent while it was still soft. So within the first year after the flood, the best way to tell which of those hypotheses is best would be to actually look at samples of this kind of rock in this spot where it's bent and several miles away uh, under a scanning electron microscope to see the shape and the condition of the quartz, feldspar, mica, and other mineral crystals. If those crystals are squished and elongated, it would indicate rocks that formed under immense pressure and heat. If those crystals still have their original shape and are cemented together by material like limestone that holds those rocks together without metamorphosis, without change, then this was bent while it was soft. Uh, a one of my mentors is a geologist. Oh golly, why can't I remember his name? He was one of the guys who was in the Grand Canyon with me. Uh, yep, and the name's not coming back to me. I'm having a presidential moment here. Uh, Spent 15 years arguing with the U.S. Geological Survey and then the National Park Service to get permission to take some microscopic samples from this fold in the rock. It took 15 years and lawsuits to get them to allow for this study. He spent the roughly 3 years of COVID quarantine in Australia studying these rocks, these samples under his microscope, and has just published his conclusion that in fact these crystals show no deformation. These folds happened while the material was still wet, like wet concrete. There's no deformation. There's no metamorphosis in these rocks. And that's easily demonstrable at the microscopic level. His 60-page paper is published now in uh, one of the big British scientific journals, and we'll see if anybody responds to it. They, in order to respond to it, they'd have to do their own study. So far, nobody has. So the conclusion is clear. This was laid down quickly, and all of the layers above it were laid down quickly. These folds continue up into some of the other layers above. So the whole Grand Canyon was moved and compressed and pushed around, which is exactly what the Bible suggests. The earth rose up and the water flowed off into the deep ocean basins. That movement would have ended the flood and uh, left us with what we see today. This is a bit of basalt. This is toward the end of the Grand Canyon. There's other basalt very early that we call the Cardenas Formation. The Cardenas Formation is a part of the basement rocks, and it's very old. It's a part of the actually a part of the creation uh, sequence, and this is the later Tapeats Formation, a fairly recent volcano, sometime well after the Grand Canyon itself was formed. Blew up outside the Grand Canyon, and a whole lot of basalt flowed down into the canyon and apparently blocked it for a time. We can actually find the what they call the bathtub ring in the Grand Canyon, where the water level of the Colorado River was quite a lot higher, several hundred feet higher than it is now, until it finally broke through and washed all this rock away. Scientists put together a study of radiometric dating of the basalt samples, the lava rock samples in the Tapeats Formation and in the Cardenas Formation. And when we compare those, they did 4 different kinds of radiometric dating. Uranium lead is the most common, but there's also other ways of dating the rocks. What the labs, and there are 8 different laboratories in different parts of the world that were sent these samples for testing. And all 8 came back, and they came with a range of dates. They're relatively consistent. All 8 selections of all of these uh, different bits of rock. What they found was that the 4 different radiometric methods give us 4 completely different dates, dividing from one another by up to 1 billion years. But they're consistent. And the other thing that's consistent is that the Cardenas basalt, which is part of the basement rock, and the Tapeats basalt, which is the most recent layer, have the same set of 4 dates. So they date them to the same age. That means that radiometric dating, the famous uranium lead dating method that all of the scientists use to date the rocks, is essentially useless. What it gives us is the ratio of parent and daughter elements, the original radioactive element and the and the byproduct element, the decay product. Uh, how do you know how old it is? Well, you have to assume something. And if you assume that it's billions of years old, then you're going to find out it was billions of years old. This tells us the composition of the rock when it was formed. That's all it tells us. And decay has certainly happened along the way, but it doesn't give us any clues at all to the age of the rock. So let's look at what the biblical model actually tells us. First of all, day one, the basic structure and the basement rock was laid down, and over the top of that was the ocean, and it's called a deep ocean. The movement of the deep water on the day of creation and through the third day would have created sedimentation, even in this early period. As soon as there was light and energy, the water would have been liquid and would have begun the process of erosion and sedimentation. On the third day of creation, dry land appears. That means a continent rose covering a good part of the Earth's surface. That land rose up while the ocean basins went down. It doesn't mean necessarily that very high mountains appeared, just that dry land appeared. We don't begin seeing mountain formation until after the flood. So when people talk about the flood covering the high mountains up to 8 meters above, uh, that's important. But the high mountains were not many miles; they were maybe a few hundred feet. Uh, the There was one large continent that afterwards drifted apart after the flood. The third day, tremendous motion, a lot of folding and breaking, and water runoff would have occurred. Dry land appeared. There were mountains, there were sea coasts, there were sediments, there were rivers. All of this began happening before man was created. The basement rocks and their sedimentary overburden would have been in place. So by the time of the third day, we've already got some of that uh, uh, Grand Canyon sequence in place. By the fifth day, there was soil, actual soil, because that's when the plants begin to appear. Animals and man appeared on the sixth day, and they were all created with apparent age. All of this was created with apparent age. Adam in the Garden of Eden would have picked up a rock and thought that it looked like a very old rock. If he believed in millions of years, he would have believed it had been there for millions of years. But he knew he had just been created, and God had explained to him that this whole universe was mere days old. Okay, this is the concept of apparent age. God wasn't trying to fool anybody. He's telling the truth about the age. Uh, the uh, no, 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 no. The earth was created like the rest of the universe with an apparent age. After creation, the fall happened. Okay, the fall and the curse. Because of the curse, we see things dying. Things begin to deteriorate. There was no death prior to Adam's fall. That means if you believe uh, that uh, that the fossil record shows all of the billions of years of things dying prior to Adam and Eve, you've got some explaining to do. Because prior to the fall and the curse, which includes death, there was no death. Men and animals didn't die before the flood or before the fall of Adam. Uh, that's a very, very important theological point, and it makes it impossible to really hold to a theistic evolution. So when the flood happened, the first thing that happens is that the water is coming up. The floodgates of the sky opened. The fountains of the great deep were broken open, and it began to rain. The fountains of the great deep might be water. There are some scholars who say there was water underground in big reservoirs that came gushing up. I've never seen good evidence for that, uh, but it does make sense of the language. It could also be volcanic activity, which makes also very good sense. The water came down from what we sometimes call the vapor canopy overhead. It appears that there was no rain and that there were clouds all around the earth that kept everything fairly humid and would explain a lot of the consistency uh, of the climate all over the Earth's surface. So you get elephants wandering around in Siberia. Well, what were they doing in Siberia? Well, it's where they lived. There was a jungle there, but that's prior to the flood. So as the flood rises for 40 days, you get water, lava. The possibility of ice at this time is suggested by some scholars. No, probably not. The flood prevails. The term in English is a translation of a word that means to slosh, to come and go. The water moves in tidal flows all over the surface of the earth. And the deep water would slosh up over the ground. There would be enough water that the Coriolis effect would have things moving constantly in very large quantities all over the earth, scouring things down. All of the dirt and rock and crystalline structure in the water would be moving things around. Things would settle out based on their weight. And so you get the Tapete sandstone, very large crystals, like very heavy grit sandpaper, grinding this down. Um, the next thing that happens is the receding of the flood. After prevailing for 150 days, it recedes for 150 days. As the flood recedes, the ocean basins would go down to form a location, a place for the floodwaters. The land itself would be raised up. And at this time, more braking, more uplift, more movement. At this time, huge amounts of erosion would take place. This is when the Grand Canyon itself was carved. As the land was lifted up to 6 or 12,000 feet, the floodwaters flowed off. The erosion and the uplift happened simultaneously. And then Noah and his family landed in the mountains of Ararat in the corner between Turkey, Armenia, Russia, and Iran, Iraq to the south, up in that rugged country. And they came out, they began to live again. And the human race from that point on dates back to that spot. Okay, there's a lot more I could tell you about that. We won't. After the flood, the volcanoes continued to erupt. There would have been smoke and dust in the air. Many scholars posit a kind of ice age immediately after the flood, so that the northern and southern polar regions were covered by glaciers. And we can definitely see that. As those glaciers formed, they would have backed up huge amounts of water. And when those glaciers melted, the water flowed down. Where we live in northern Idaho is very close to an area called the Purcell Trench. It's a very long valley, goes from central Canada down into the Columbia River Basin. And at one time, there was a gigantic ice dam near Missoula, Montana, of all places. And when that dam broke, the water and all of the gravel and rocks and dirt and all that stuff ran down through Idaho into Washington and then spread out over an area of eastern Washington that we call the channeled scablands. There's lots and lots and lots of evidence in Washington, Idaho, Montana, and southern Canada for this, what the secular scientists call the Great Missoula Flood. And when I was flying, there's lots of evidence for the flood that we continue to see. So enough of that. Let me conclude. Biblical scholars, and I consider myself a biblical scholar, don't agree or don't disagree with the evidence of geology and biology. Matter of fact, I really like looking at the evidence. I like looking at geology because it makes such good sense. When you're looking at the actual rocks in their context and trying to explain how they got here, the Bible fits so well. Biblical scholars don't disagree with this at all. We approach the evidence from a God-centered perspective and with the presupposition that God is and he can do whatever he wants to. He says he created the heavens and the earth. There's no reason at all that God couldn't do that. And there's no reason for God to lie. God says he sent a flood to destroy the earth. And the geology supports that. And there's no reason for God to lie. We believe there is a God. Creation and the catastrophe of the flood are not only possible, but necessary. The flood itself actually explains the evidence that we see as we walk out into the broader world and really try to explain the material evidence. It's clear what we're actually looking at. And it's evidence of what we really see there. Okay. I'm going to quit. We're going to come back next week and get further into Genesis. I want to see how Genesis in chapters 8 and 9 begins laying the foundation for the rest of history. Let me unmute everybody. Come here. Oops. Yeah. So that we can come back and say bye-bye. Good to see everybody, man. It's really fun to get the group together again, guys. I mean, I love you guys. Oscar, I'm going to see you sooner than I see most everybody else, man. We'll see you there in June. Good to see you, man. Fregosa, yeah, and everybody else, and Teresa, always a pleasure. I see you in headphones there. Good thinking. Best way to do this. Okay, we're going to take off now. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao tutti.
Ciao, Dr. Jan. Thank
Ciao
you.
tutti.
Grazie.
Dr. Jan.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, Ma'am Donna.
Hi, Roger.
Ciao, Sister Donna.
Ciao, ciao, grazie.